So to wrap up this chapter now, we're going to analyze how those first views of the supply dominant view of supply leads to demand, so we should invest in the supply, stimulate the supply, versus the demand is the best way to stimulate economic growth. We should always want more demand. The Keynesian versus the neoclassical view, right? And that's what we're going to look into here. How can we use those views into this framework? Okay, and hopefully you see that despite them having this big dispute and have very different views, they can both be useful. And hopefully this highlights to you that despite your view or anything, it's always worth to listen to somebody else. Why? Because maybe they'll make you think about one thing that you didn't, or maybe the economy and things around us is also changing, which also highlights that we should always be reconsidering what we're thinking, because we should always evolve with the economy so we can understand what's going on. Okay, so remember Keynes' law, demands create its own supply, and Say's law, supply creates its own demand. And you can go back to video 1 if you want to get a better idea of all those things. Also, if you're interested in these types of views, the Keynesian neoclassical view we're about to discuss, and or you're moving forward with economics in your career, in your academic path, I really, really recommend you go through chapter 12 and 13. Okay, they're going to expand through the Keynesian and neoclassical view, and it can be very useful. So I'm also open to discuss those as well during the virtual class if you're interested. All right, so let's focus on each one at a time and see which, look at the graph when they would be more useful for economic policy. Should we focus on demand or the supply? Let's start with the demand, okay? So in the Keynesian perspective, we know that this is going to be focused on the demand side, which then we know that due to aggregate demand be equal to the GDP, which is equal to the GDP formula, that anything that impacts one of the 4 components of GDP will result in a shift, increase or decrease of the aggregate demand. Okay, so here you're going to see an increase, so we're shifting to the right, and those are all things that could shift aggregate demand to the right. Okay, and here we're going to see a decrease, so those would be all things that would shift aggregate demand to the left. Take a time, pause the video, and just try a couple. Try to see if, given a situation, you can rationalize through your intuition what would happen in the graph for the aggregate demand and aggregate supply. What is the outcome of that model in terms of what happened to inflation, unemployment? Okay, it's a really good exercise, and I recommend that you try so. Okay, now talk a little bit more about this view, since there's a whole chapter about it, but we're going to summarize it just because of the purposes of how the class went this semester with the online pandemic and all those things. Let's summarize what the Keynesian view is, and we have discussed some of this during the semester, so it's kind of going to be a little bit of a review from previous chapters. But the idea here is that we talked about price stickiness, right? And we talked about the Keynesians enjoying stimulating the aggregate demand to produce economic growth. And they believe in price stickiness as well. They don't think that prices are going to adjust very quickly, and that's an assumption of this model. Okay. The question is there a point in the current method that we're using, the current model, where prices are sticky, where prices don't react a lot to changes in production in the economy? And hopefully you start to think about, when we started to talk about all of this, one of the first things we talked about was the shape of the short-run aggregate supply curve. Okay. If this is what are you talking about at the moment, please go back to the first 2 videos and rewatch them. They're going to clarify a lot of what I'm talking about here. Okay. But the idea here is that, hey, given the shape of that curve, we know that the part of that curve where is associated with the price level not being very sensitive, not changing a lot, given changes in output, is in the flat part of that curve. Now remember, the economy is going to be where short-run aggregate supply meets with aggregate demand. So that means if aggregate demand is meeting with that curve where it's still flat, then maybe it's characterizing a situation of the economy that matches more of the view of the Keynesian perspective. Okay, and that's extremely valid given the methodology. So now the next step would be, is this applicable in the real world? Let's test this, and that's what research would do. But we're learning through the intuition and theory here, and based on also on previous research that was done, right? Okay, how about the neoclassical view? Well, they believe you can see is usually the opposite. So you can imagine they believed in the supply being the one that should be stimulated to cause real economic growth, and they think that prices adjust very quickly. Okay, that's one assumptions of their view. Okay, the way they think about this is that the country is usually going to fluctuate about production, about producing close to the potential GDP level, to the maximum, to the optimal level of production given the current situation of the economy. right? And if the current GDP, if the optimal production, if we're going to keep producing around it, right, then that means that, hey, we're not going to really be growing unless we're improving short-run aggregate supply or long-run aggregate supply, right? So the idea is that let's stimulate long-run aggregate supply. That's the goal of this model. Okay. Okay. So the truth is, does prices adjust very quickly? Well, one thing to think about to know whether prices are going to adjust very quickly is to think about how fast do people change their expectations. So if government says, hey, we're going to try to lower inflation, do people quickly start to react? So do they respond accordingly? Right. So this would depend on how people react to economics news, and this would depend on whether people have rational or adaptive expectations. Okay, so people with rational expectations, they put weight, they take current information, okay, and make the best prediction they have based on all the current information. Okay, so that means if somebody comes out now and say, hey, we're going to try to lower inflation, then that means they're going to really believe, hey, they're going to try to lower inflation right now, and that's what I want to believe. Okay, they adjust very quickly their expectations. The adaptive expectations are a little bit more, let's say, careful with changing their view. They slowly change their view. So that means, like, if we're going through periods of high inflation and the government comes out and say, hey, we're going to lower inflation, an a person with adaptive expectations would say, okay, but I'm just gonna start reacting to that when I see the data changing, because I believe a lot on past experience, and it needs a lot for me to gradually change to a different view. Okay, so those people will not change their view as quickly, making their reaction to economic news slower as well. So that would depend on how people react. If people react quickly, then maybe we have more of a less price sticky and more flexibility. But if people are very slow, then maybe prices change a lot slower. Okay, remember, there's contracts, there's a lot that play a role here in determining whether people can even change their prices very quickly. Okay, but the idea here is that, okay, we need to incentivize the long run aggregate supply, which means then we should invest in a lot of things that are permanent, that cause permanent growth in the economy, right? Not only things that promote short-term growth, but also things that promote long-term growth. Okay, so now we're reaching for higher productivity, right? If you remember all the way from when we talked about the shifts of aggregate supply curve in this chapter, right? We talked about the shifts in productivity being one that can cause both supply curves to shift in this model. Okay. Now, this is just an example to show you guys exactly what we talked about so far. And just to give you an idea how this was unfold, right? Let's say here that our economy is at E0, and then let me look exactly of the same thing. There's an increase in aggregate demand. Okay, given an increase in aggregate demand, firms are gonna try to produce more because they want to sell more. And let's say there's increasing aggregate demand because they're trying to promote a Keynesian perspective of let's stimulate aggregate demand to produce more growth. Okay, if that's the case, then the aggregate demand is going to shift right away because of the stimulus. Let's say a tax cut, right? And if that's the case, is that sustainable? Well, Eddie, I can notice here that we are past the long run aggregate supply, which means that the most efficient level, given the current scenario of the economy, is to stay at that level at 500. So that means that if we're past $500 billion in this case, we're producing too much, okay? You can see that because then, given that resources are very scarce because unemployment is very low, because we're producing more than what is efficient for this time period, people are going to start bidding up on wages to try to get workers because they want to produce more because they know that the demand wants it, okay? When they start bidding up wages, guess what happens with the price of inputs? They go up. They go up, why? Because wage is the price of input of labor. And if that's the case, as we know, cost per inflation leads to decreases in the short run aggregate supply, which means we're going to go back to where we should have been anyway. So that stimulus was not necessary. And not only that, that stimulus led to higher inflation at the end of it all. Okay, so that's the idea of the neoclassical view, is that unless we're really promoting growth in the long run aggregate supply, we're not going to grow. Okay, Now, given the graph that we've analyzed so far and the method, it's kind of becoming clear what part is for what, right? As we already discussed, the Keynesian view is more related to the flat zone because you can see that it correlates with their sticky price. And seeing that increase in aggregate demand actually lead us to lower unemployment, right? And despite a little bit more of inflation, a lot of resources are not being used, so the inflation increase is going to be very small. Okay. Now the neoclassical view sees the opposite, right? They see that, hey, prices are going to move a lot, and maybe that's the case when resources are a lot more constrained. And resources are a lot more constrained when we're producing past or very close to, definitely past the potential GDP line or long run aggregate supply, because then people have to bid up on wages to get more workers, and you can see price level moving more flexibly. Okay, so that's the idea. How can we incorporate everything that we talked about so far, the idea of how to analyze unemployment and inflation with different views that can guide us. What type of policy should we implement? Should we implement policies that stimulate the aggregate demand or that stimulate the long run productivity of the country? Okay, and we're going to be able to connect on the future 2 chapters with fiscal monetary policies and see how those policies can stimulate the economy to grow and through which channels they do so. Okay, so let me know if you guys have any questions, and look forward to recording the next videos for you guys.